So, Grandma, I'm here to talk to you about consent today. Do you understand what patient consent is?
Not really.
Okay, well, no, that's what I'm here for. And that's what we're going to do here today. So, you know how in America you have these basic rights by they talk about the Constitution and all that, right? Your right to vote, your right to bear arms, your right to pursue happiness. So you have certain rights as a patient as well, and unfortunately those aren't communicated really clearly a lot of the times. But you have the right to choose or refuse certain medical cares, you have the right to privacy, and it's important that you know these rights as a patient because it directly affects you and what your body will suffer and go through during certain treatments. So, you know me, I'm Karan, and then my partners that help put this together are Connor, Jonah, Jake, and Nick. And we're just going to go through consent and what that is and what that means. So, consent is your permission for something to happen or your agreement to do something. For example, if I ask you to do something and you say yes, then you consent and say that I'm going to do that, yes, I want to do that. Or if you say no, then no, I don't want to do that. And there's 4 categories that it could be divided into: express consent, implied consent, informed consent, and subjective or objective consent. And the types underneath those are general, temporary, special, and refusal. And we're going to go through what each of those means right now. So express consent is probably the one you're most familiar with. It's known as explicit or direct consent. It's either you agree or disagree. There's no in between, no gray area. So if you shake your head yes and say yes, or if you shake your head no and say no. It could be either written or oral. So if you sign a form saying you want to do this, then you're giving consent in that way. Or if you're saying yes, then you're giving consent in that way. If it's oral, it has to be witnessed by a nurse or someone else in the hospital, and it needs to be documented in the medical record because when you sign it, they have your paper in the record, so they have your consent there. It requires a procedure that you're consenting to, the purpose of the procedure, the treatment, any risks or consequences with it, the probability of success, any alternatives, so any other things you could do besides what they're suggesting, and any associated risks, and then what would happen if you didn't go and do anything about what you had. So if you didn't get the treatment and you didn't do any alternatives, what could happen to you? And then it requires your statement of understanding, signature and date, so it removes the hospital of any liability if you understood what everything that could have happened and you decided not to do it. You sign something saying the hospital can't be responsible for what happens to you then. Then there's applied consent. That's an action or silence that raises the presumption that consent has been authorized. So based on your actions or your facts and circumstances of the situation. So this is a bit different because say you were paralyzed and because you were in an accident and you needed treatment, you would probably be taken to the emergency room in that case, but you have no way of giving consent in that way, but they understand that you still need treatment, so they're going to go ahead and treat you because you're obviously in pain and in a different situation. And then there's informed consent. That's your right to know the risks, benefits, and alternatives before you undergo any medical procedure, treatment of any kind. That's why it's informed, because you need to be informed before you give consent. And you need to know what you're going to go through and anything that could happen to you because of it. Otherwise, something bad could happen, and then who will be responsible then? If you aren't being informed properly, so if you don't know everything that's going to happen to you, then the medical staff aren't doing their job properly, and that's when the hospital can be held responsible, and that's when lawsuits and stuff like that could happen. You need to make sure you understand and evaluate the options properly though. If you don't understand, then it's also your job to ask and clarify. So some people don't like asking when they don't understand things or clarifying because sometimes it makes them feel like they're dumb or they don't know. But it's also your job to make sure you understand everything, because otherwise if you don't and you sign a form saying you understand and something bad happens to you, then they can't do anything. It's on you then if you didn't understand in the first place. And it's the physician's duty to inform you of any and all risks. If they don't, or if you do not understand, get somebody that does, that can explain it to you. So if you don't understand everything that could happen to you, like if you go to a hospital, then you take someone else that can. So like you take me, and I can sit with you and I could help translate kind of what the doctor would be saying, so to make sure you understand everything that could happen. And then there is subjective and objective consent. Subjective consent is the one the patient as an individual would have done if fully informed. So say you didn't understand everything that was going to happen, so you weren't fully informed. So subjective consent is, well, what would you have done if you did know everything? So if you, for example, if you said no to a certain treatment because you didn't understand that it would basically kill you, if you didn't say yes, you didn't understand there. So subjective is what would you have done if you did understand, you would have said yes. And then objective consent is what someone with similar circumstances would typically consent to. So that's like the average guy. If he was in the same circumstance as you, if he had rheumatoid arthritis or something, and was going for a treatment, what would he do? Like, what would the average person do? So the difference is subjective relates directly to you, and what would you do? When you didn't receive all necessary information, while objective consent is when a patient is given all the information needed and consents to the treatment after. And then there's the 4 types of consent. There's general, temporary, special, and refusal. Those were the 4 categories, and these are the 4 types. So general consent, it's accepted for just routine tests. So say I need a vaccination, you know, how I get a flu shot or a tetanus shot. General consent is what you would give in that case. So, or you get like your blood pressure read. So it checks your vital signs, your blood count. It's not accepted for any procedure or treatment that could put you at risk. So if you're going to go get surgery, general consent wouldn't work. That type of consent wouldn't be accepted. It's typically used to obtain information that is necessary for the initial treatment. So it's basically an introductory level, base level consent. Like, if I'm going to go get a checkup, I'm going to give this type of consent and it will work. If I was going to go get a surgery, it wouldn't work. You would need a special consent for that. And then there's temporary consent. So temporary consent is different in the way that it says temporary. It doesn't suffice for the full period of time. And this is, there could be several different gray areas for this. One type of temporary consent is, say, you know, when I was younger and I went to elementary school and I got hurt on the playground playing. Now I'm a minor, so technically they need consent from you because you were my guardian at the time. But, you know, if I got hurt really bad and the nurse is there, they're not going to wait to just call you to treat me. They'll call you about it later, but they're going to go ahead and treat me because they know that, hey, I'm bleeding out here, my elbow's broken or something, so they need to treat me right away or send me to the hospital. They're not going to wait for you in that case, but they will call you back later and get that consent. So the consent of the nurse or the consent of the teacher would be good for that amount of time, and it'll be temporary until they get you to make sure everything that's okay with that. Do you understand that? Is that pretty clear?
Yeah.
Cool. And then there's special consent, and this is what you need for surgeries or other treatments. So it's a type of consent that has to be obtained when a treatment or procedure has an unusual risk associated with it. So say like you were going to get a procedure done, a surgery done, but you had maybe a chance of death, dying from the surgery. So this is a type of consent that they would have to get from you. It helps relieve the physician and medical staff of any liability if you agree and the procedure is followed properly. So if the procedure is not followed properly, that means they're responsible for it if anything bad happens to you. But if it is followed properly, and if you said yes, then if something bad happened, the medical staff would be free of any liability. So you couldn't file a lawsuit or anything like that because you understood. So in this way, if the procedure isn't followed or the risks aren't told to you, like I said, the medical staff haven't done their job properly. The examples that require some special consent is experimental research or treatment. You know, have you heard that Quintiles commercial? How Quintiles is always calling for experimental studies and all that.
Yeah.
They need this type of consent because it's experimental. They could be giving you a pill, and you don't know what it would do to you because it's experimental. They haven't tested it yet. So they would need special consent to do that. The biggest part is that with special consent, there are usually special risks involved, so you must make sure you understand these risks. And if not, then do not consent, at least until you fully understand the risks. And then there is a patient refusal. This is your right to refuse to any medical treatment and say no. So AMA stands for Against Medical Advice, and under this, patients have the right to refuse treatments. You must be well informed before you say no. You can't just go into a hospital and say, no, I'm not going to do this, until they sit you down and tell you everything that could be involved with the procedure. So you must be well informed. It can be religious, so because you're a certain religion and some doctrine says you can't do this treatment, then you could say no because of that, and they'll have to respect it. But you have to sign off on a refusal form to make sure to relieve the hospital of any liability. So you can't, if something bad happens to you, you can't go back and say, oh, you didn't do this, like you didn't say yes, so they couldn't do it. And informed consent plays into here because it's a decision based upon the facts of the case, and it's your personal choice after doctor provides all options. Now, if you say no, the state can decide to provide a treatment under circumstances, so they could get a court order and tell you, no, come back, you're gonna die, like, you need this treatment. Or if you're the guardian of me and I was younger, like if I was under 18 at the time and I needed a treatment, but you weren't letting me get that treatment because of a religious reason or something, they could get a court order and say, no, like, he's gonna get the treatment, otherwise he's gonna die or something bad's gonna happen to him. And the important part to remember with this is no doctor can force you to do anything you don't want to do. And you have the right to be informed about every procedure, surgery, medication, or anything that they want you to go through. And that's basically what consent is. Do you kind of have a better understanding of what that means?
Yes, I do.
And how that relates to you?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, okay, so what do you think?
I think it was very good. It helped me to understand.
All right.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, that's it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Did you get it?
Yeah.